it's looking like we're on the edge of a new period in psychedelics history that's only defined by high public interest and much better scientific research. The psychedelic renaissance. Today we'll be covering the brief history of psychedelics, and I want to preface this with the fact that it is very brief. You could easily teach a year-long course on the history of psychedelic use within one region or subject, so please know that this is a summary with a very wide scope. Drop a comment below if you want to hear more about the history behind a more specific region or subject. And if you haven't already, definitely check out our video from a few weeks ago, What Are Psychedelics? It'll give this history a lot more meaningful context. Without further ado, let's check out the brief history of psychedelics. Before we talk about our humanity's history with psychedelics, I want to look at how they got here to begin with. Psychedelics didn't just pop up when humans started synthesizing them. Mushrooms have been slowly evolving to produce specialized psychedelic compounds for millions of years. Although the psilocybin that is produced by a wide variety of magic mushroom species has received the most attention for its promising therapeutic properties and its role in our spiritual and cultural histories, its ecological functions and evolutionary origin is relatively under-researched and likely preceded human use by tens of millions of years. Those ecological functions are highly debated, but the current general belief when considering psychoactive substances produced by plants is that all of these substances evolved as an adaptive chemical defense mechanism in some form or fashion, a way to deter predators from eating them. However, as psychedelics have gained more public attention, this belief has been reevaluated. Awan et al.'s 2018 study supported that fly larvae specialized to grow in Psilocybe sinensis actually manages to infect the mushroom's gene expression, prompting us to reevaluate if psilocybin primarily evolved as a chemical defense. The serotonin that psilocybin use promotes in the brain is known to be key in the healthy development of movement and feeding behaviors in flies. And it doesn't make a lot of sense for this mushroom to produce a chemical that just attracts organisms that thrive off of destroying its genome. That's the whole way it preserves its many abilities needed to survive in the wild. The laws of nature, as we currently understand them, should cause that mushroom to go extinct. But amazingly, Psilocybe sinensis can still be found in the wild on both sides of the Atlantic today. More modern theories support that the neuroactivity of psilocybin mediates highly complex interactions between mushrooms and other organisms, with Meyer and Slott postulating that the rush of serotonin granted to an animal by eating psychedelic mushrooms may still be to the evolutionary benefit of the mushroom. The tripping animal's varied motor behaviors and tendency to increase its travel distance may actually serve to better spread the psychedelic mushroom spores, and this may also serve to explain why psilocybin and structurally similar psychedelic chemicals can be found around the globe in over 170 species and 4 genera of mushrooms. Don't forget that almost all this ecological research is incredibly modern, and as such, needs to be tested and retested. Most of the citations in the papers I just referenced are from the early to mid-2000s, which is incredibly recent for scientific research. But back to history. When did humans first start eating these mushrooms and interacting with their psychedelic properties? This goes back to the Paleolithic era, sometime between 100,000 and 1 million years ago, when humanity was still largely operating in a hunter-gatherer gender binary that had men acting as hunters and women as gatherers. Because of this, women would usually have first contact with foreign vegetation, and it's almost certain that the first human to trip was a female mushroom gatherer. Or maybe it's the other way around, and the first mushroom gatherer to trip became the first human. That's what Terence McKenna, a popular mystic and ethnobotanist, believed. He coined the stoned ape theory, a theory that proposes that the first modern Homo sapien brains were fundamentally shaped by psychedelic mushroom use. McKenna believed that this occurred around the time that humanity started the roots of modern-day cattle farming, that we discovered dung-loving psychedelic mushrooms in the wastes of our prey while following herds of large animals to slowly and sustainably hunt. He argued that consistent exposure to the psychedelic effects of these mushrooms was a major force behind the rapid expansion of the brain that can be observed between Homo erectus and Homo sapien, causing primitive psilocybin-eating groups to have an enhanced capacity for the development of communication and creativity. McKenna died in 2000, and to this day, most of the scientific community dismisses this theory per lack of evidence, although modern research may be catching up to his claims. Neuroscientists from Imperial College found that psilocybin induces some forms of neurogenesis, actually creating new, more interconnected pathways in the brain. Psychedelic effects induced by psilocybin both dissolve the default network of the brain, or the ego that sums up a human's personality and thoughts, and catalyzes the development of a more interconnected network. Researchers at Johns Hopkins are in agreement with their colleagues at Imperial College, confirming that this property of psilocybin resulted in long-term positive changes to their participants' personalities. While it might be challenging to find hard archaeological evidence of the ancient transition, these newly discovered neurogenerative properties of psilocybin might be just the chemical and mechanical evidence that McKenna was looking for. Either way, at some point in prehistory, the first human had the first psychedelic experience. So what did we do next? The answer is not super clear. Scientists rely on the archaeological record created by artifacts, art, and any intentionally prepared substance to try to piece together the puzzle that is early human history. We do know that psychedelics were key to the ritual and ceremonial setting of prehistory, as archaeological carbon dating has suggested that mescaline-bearing cactus has been used in ritual by indigenous peoples of northern Mexico for over 10,000 years. And carbon-dated cave paintings found in Algeria show that at around the same time, shamans in northern Africa were painting psilocybin-bearing mushrooms on cave walls. The link between psychedelics and shamanism in prehistory is very widely accepted, with some scholars arguing that the ancient roots of shamanistic ritual were actually created specifically in reference to psychedelic experiences in order to better contextualize how to use the power of these experiences. Artifacts and texts from more modern prehistory, or at this point maybe just the earliest days of history, suggest that psychedelics were still in use as long as 3,000 years ago in regions as far apart as Central America and India. However, this is around the time that the Western mindset began to really dominate the globe with the rise and spread of the Roman Empire. And it's incredibly important to note that psychedelic use has not been strongly associated with any historical European practices, with the exception of Siberian shamans, but we'll get to them in a second. This is likely due to the fact that Europe has few species of psychoactive plants, especially when compared to entheogen-rich areas like the Americas. As a result, there's very little archaeological association between entheogenic practices and the origins of Western medicinal, ritual, or communal practices, especially in comparison to some traditions native to the New World that are purely based out of ritual psychedelic use. As a consequence of this, psychedelics had a very small impression on global history from the time of the Roman Empire up until the first explorations of ethnobotanists during the 19th century, with the key exception being the shamans of Siberia. The word shaman was actually originally derived from the Siberian healers that guide their patients with psychoactive plants and other natural medicines. The term was apparently first recorded by an exiled Russian priest in 1672, reaching Western audiences at the turn of the 18th century, and immediately kicking imaginations into gear. The Santa Claus mythology was created in part by mysticized versions of Siberian shamanism. While he is also derived from the Catholic figure St. Nicholas, it's thought that tales of Siberian shamans flying with psychedelic insight among the northern lights helped inspire Santa's magical sleigh. The flying reindeer trope comes from them too. It's likely that, to avoid being directly poisoned, these healers fed the mushrooms to reindeer, collecting and using their urine in ceremony. Remember, Siberian shamans are the exception, not the rule, as psychedelic use did not see a lot of global impact during this period. This is not to say that cultures founded upon their use stopped using psychedelics. Remember the people of northern Mexico that have been using mescaline for over 10,000 years? These are the Huichol Native Americans, a tribe that still uses peyote, sacred mescaline-bearing cactus, in ceremony today. And it's likely that any culturally significant shamanistic practices or any other forms of psychedelic healing that are preserved today were present long before that culture started recording their history, or before Westerners started recording their history. Remember those 19th century ethnobotanists I was talking about? An ethnobotanist is a relatively antiquated term for a researcher who studies plant use in a specific culture. Nowadays, botanical anthropologists or entheogenic anthropologists would be a more appropriate term. Darwin's release of The Origin of Species in 1859 drove many of these researchers to try to study human cultures through the same scientific lens that Darwin applied to nature, with Sir James George Fraser as one of the first to capture sacred plant use in exotic ceremonies for the Western mind in his volumes of The Golden Bough, first published in 1890. Fraser, and many of his contemporaries, could never find deeper meaning in these entheogenic practices, labeling them as primitive and evaluating that only religion could save these cultures and bring them to the science and, good parts of modernity. Remember, Fraser, Darwin, and most of their noted contemporaries were British aristocrats who had the funds to travel the world and only saw benefit in the British colonial complex that allowed them to glide through exotic lands as they pleased. At the time, there was almost no scientific understanding of psychoactive substances at all, and they couldn't have known that their incredibly biased cultural research would help set a foundation that poisoned the public view of anything culturally entheogenic for over a century. At this point in history, a more sterile point of view takes over, as the scientific community's interest in psychoactivity started to grow around the turn of the 20th century, and began to boom between Anton Coelich's synthesis of MDMA in 1912 and Albert Hofmann's first LSD trip in 1943. Fun fact, Hofmann actually synthesized LSD in 1938 and forgot about it for 5 years, taking what he thought was a very small dose while biking home from the lab on April 19th. And this is now celebrated as Bicycle Day to commemorate the first LSD trip in the world. During the same period, mescaline studies inspired by the exotic writings of 19th century ethnobotanists were evaluating the substance to have symptoms that put its user into a psychotic-like frenzy, labeling all psychoactive substances as psychotomimetics, or substances that mimic the effect of psychotic symptoms, really before proper research could even begin. World War II seems to have dampened spirits for psychedelic research, but by the time that R. Gordon Wasson was served psychedelic mushrooms by Maria Sabina, a Mazatec shaman, and publicized this experience in a photo essay in the 1957 issue of Life magazine, everyone had begun to take notice of what psychedelics might have to offer, and research was being done in full force. Most people today know about psychedelics through the war on drugs that began in America over the next 2 decades, with cannabis and LSD use heavily associated with the countercultural hippie movement actively protesting the war in Vietnam. To the traditional conservatives that supported the war, liberal political opinions were seen as a consequence of young college-age adults being exposed to these dangerous drugs.
Are you high? What? No, I'm not high.
You are high as a kite!
Most scholars credit this exposure to Timothy Leary and the Harvard Psilocybin Project, a series of experiments that used college students as subjects when researching the effects of psilocybin that ran from 1960 to 1963. The project was disbanded after reports of biased and cavalier science, but the genie was already out of the bottle. Leary actively campaigned for young minds to use psychedelic substances, and his motto of "turn on, tune in, drop out" was met with harsh resistance as the mentally liberated countercultural movement clashed with the traditional political system. The war in Vietnam catalyzed a cultural clash that was rooted in resistance to violence and conformity, a history of xenophobic policies surrounding drug control, and a mysticized perception of entheogenic use created by colonial tendencies, with Nixon's administration bringing the conflict to a head as Congress passed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Control and Prevention Act of 1970. Helped along by the DARE campaign established by the Reagan administration the next decade, psychedelic research was almost totally abandoned for half a century, as it was completely illegal to report any new scientific findings regarding psychedelics in America. As such, almost all of the Western world followed. You have to remember that this was only 25 years after the nuclear bomb had been dropped, and just 1 year after the moon landing. So American scientific thought was still the highest standard in the West at this point in time. While psychedelics still existed around the world, they were treated as a fringe interest for cultural anthropology and a novelty for the developing field of neuroscience from 1970 to 2020. While there are some studies that were published between the 80s and the 10s, they're very few and far between. And pretty much all are non-experimental literature reviews designed to recap the research of the 50s and 60s or urge regulatory bodies to allow research on psychedelics again. This finally happened in 2020, as Oregon passed the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act, following the trend of states legalizing substances with known medicinal properties in spite of federal scheduling that California started with the legalization of medicinal marijuana in 1996. With the first healing centers opening in Oregon, and the NIH funding research on psychedelics for the first time since the establishment of the DEA this year, it's looking like we're on the edge of a new period in psychedelics history, that's only defined by high public interest and much better scientific research. The psychedelic renaissance. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed. Don't get psyched out. Oh, yes! 2 takes? Are you kidding me? 2 takes? Two takes? Ha!